Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. I may have to start wearing even wider ties since we're going back to the 1970s, possibly even a leisure suit, powder blue, of course. Stacey.
Right, I know. I actually thought of wearing my poncho for this episode because you know how flower child thing was happening in the 70s. And of course, you and I remember the 70s during the oil embargo and then the Iranian Revolution, which caused price spikes in gasoline and shortages here across America. And we have them again. Max and I drove from Northern Virginia down to North Carolina, so about a 325-mile drive. And as we're heading further and further south, there are more and more gas stations without any gas. And those that did have gasoline had huge lines, sometimes miles long. So it was so weird in this time of pandemic and shortages and loads of things like microchips and in the beginning of the pandemic, of course, we had food shortages. Now we also have oversupply in money and in treasuries and bonds all over the place. That's why we have negative yielding bonds and stuff like that. So we have all sorts of price signals messed up and crazy times.
Oh, right. The crisis ends and the crisis begins. That's the way it used to be. Now there is just one crisis on top of another. You don't know where one starts and one stops. And it's just a multiple crises stacked up, right there in front of you. And you're thinking to yourself, my goodness gracious, what happened?
And when I was looking at all these lines at the gas stations that did have any gasoline available, I was thinking, in the 1970s, at least we had jobs to go to, like people were working and had to work for their money. We had stagflation just like we have now. But back then, there were there was very little welfare available. And in fact, remember when New York City went broke, what did Ford say to New York City? Drop dead, said go broke. Now nobody's allowed to go broke. So there's all this money. Of course, also there are anti-gouging laws. So even though people were showing up with canisters all over the place, filling up tanks, huge tanks filled with gasoline, the price signal was saying, do it, go for it. It's cheap because you're about to have total shortage.
Right. So this price signal is an important fact to wrap our minds around. And how do empires collapse? How do countries collapse? And we saw a fantastic collapse with the Soviet Union. And they had a similar situation where it wasn't about the price signal of money failing. It was about the price signal of manufacturing failing. In other words, they were keen on putting out a certain number of farm equipment and tractors, no matter what the cost. They had no accounting for it. They just wanted this raw number of farm equipment, and that was a metric that they used. We generated X number of 100,000 tractors. And there's no price signals, so it collapsed. Here in the United States, the money itself is not driven by any kind of a price signal. It's the Politburo, called the Federal Open Market Committee, and they fix prices, or they rig prices, or they control prices, price control for the dollar. And so all price signals, like in the Soviet Union, have gone nuts. And similarly, like the Soviet Union, the United States is now collapsing.
Of course, we're comparing it to the 1970s when we also had shortages due to conflict happening in the Middle East. We're having conflict now, but that doesn't impact anything. And these price signals, back in the 1970s, we saw huge inflation, but we also saw interest rates soaring, right? So Zero Hedge points out that the last time core CPI was here, the Fed funds rate was 20%. The core CPI numbers came in and it's over 4%, but they're like, if you exclude food and energy, it's only 3%. Of course, there is that base problem where it's comparing it to last year during the middle of the beginning of the pandemic. So they're saying that's why it's higher than it is. But again, because they distort price signals, and the price signal at the gasoline station, for example, is telling you that there's no problem, no shortages, plenty of supply, $2.85 is only up 4 cents since the knockout of the pipeline happened. And that whole disintegration, we've been talking about the disintegration and the deglobalization and the entropy that happens in a system like the US dollar, which turns 50 this year, or the US empire, which maybe turns 65, 70 this year. And what you're seeing is with this, the pipeline being taken out, I mean, it's hard to get real information about it, but what it seems like is like people are saying this shouldn't be able to happen. Like that the fact that one pipeline provides 45% of the gasoline to the entire East Coast of America, but that they could be taken offline by some sort of hack or pressing an email, the wrong link or something.
Right. Well, having a lack of diversity and competition in the oil business is the result of mergers and acquisitions and the monopolization or oligopolization of the U.S. economy, thanks to cheap money and private equity and no regulators and no respect of competition or free market enterprise. Now, going back to the 1970s, yes, interest rates went up to 20% and the bond market crashed because the price signal told the central bank at the time under Paul Volcker that thanks to Richard Nixon's money printing and default on the US dollar in the 1970s and the problems associated with the cost of the Vietnam War, that had to be wrung out of the system. There was too much fiat money, had to be wrung out of the system. So at that time in the 70s, America was not scared and hiding under the bed about the fact that they would have to actually work for a living and be productive in some way. Unlike today, where people are not working, they fear the work has become a 4-letter word in America.
Well, again, it's the price signal, because as we've covered, and many in the media have been covering the fact that, with government transfers, if you're staying at home and not working out and on enhanced unemployment benefits, you're making over $16 an hour. And that is a problem. We saw that on this drive up to North Virginia and back, as we saw help wanted signs everywhere, literally everywhere, even in abandoned fields of where used to be agricultural fields along the rivers. You saw signs like delivery driver needed urgent. And that brings me to the other problem with what is happening with the gasoline, is that apparently there's also, CNN was already warning, for example, before this pipeline shut down, and that was that there would be shortages of gasoline at gas stations because there's a huge shortage of delivery drivers, because it's a very specialized field to be able to drive a tanker filled with fuel. So the pandemic shut down the schools that trained the younger ones coming online. But there's also new regulations that were brought in January of 2020, whereby if you've had any sort of drug or alcohol-related conviction, you're not allowed to drive. So that kicked off between 40 and 60,000 people that wanted to be delivery drivers, but they can't be because of these past records. So there is it's a general entropy and disintegration, right? It's like everything. It's not one thing goes wrong, everything goes wrong.
Right. Well, the problem with billionaires is not that they by some don't pay enough taxes. The problem is that they got to be billionaires by hollowing out the economy, by destroying the infrastructure, by stealing from pension accounts, from destroying the moral fabric of the country. People like Warren Buffett or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, et cetera, they did so, they achieved their wealth at the expense of the common good. They literally threw the country under the bus. And now we're dealing with the consequences of, really, it started with Reagan and Thatcher and the deregulation, and the central banks became activist under Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, and now Jay Powell, where they do the bidding of the oligarchs. And America has a very nasty oligarch problem, and we need a leader that can deal with the oligarchs. Clearly, the current policy leadership in Washington has no way to deal with oligarchy in America. That's sad.
So going back to the 1970s and comparing the situation to then, we're 50 years since the U.S. dollar began a global reserve fiat standard in 1971 when Nixon took us off the gold window. So full circle, like we started this year saying the U.S. dollar turns 50. Is it going to make this year? And of course, the entropy sets in. The entropy sets in the human being. When you turn 50, things start going wrong. It takes you longer to recover from certain things. The same thing I believe is happening. And you can see this in another zero hedge headline, and that is Rabobank Richard Nixon was the last U.S. president to face a major economic crisis involving soaring inflation and gasoline and supply chains and the Middle East and the superpower rivalry and the U.S. dollar itself. So you're starting to see all the cycle turn, the fourth turning, all the stuff, the entropy is setting in, the disintegration is happening. And I might say, again, on the drive, you could do it yourself. Anybody could go do the drive if you could find some gasoline. And what you'll see is, bizarrely, which I had not been expecting, is the Trump 2024 bumper stickers and yard signs all over the place. I was a little bit surprised to see that because I hadn't really